Yes, a very good morning once again, and many thanks for keeping it NTV Uganda. This is Morning at NTV. Romeo Busiku is my name. We had a budget reading last Thursday, 72 trillion Uganda shillings. We have a date ceiling of 96 trillion Uganda shillings, that is 52%. And also 32 trillion Uganda shillings is going to be coming from your pocket, in my pocket as well. So we are wondering, over taxation, is it the only way to steer development? Is taxation the only way to raise funds to run this economy? That's the $64,000 question. I'm here with Bernard Cankara. Well, Bernard is a researcher, public policy and governance expert at Kyambogo.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Bernard.
Thanks.
Long time. How have you been?
I've been well. I've been fine.
He's not here alone. We have Professor Ssali, the Dean, School of Gender Studies, Makerere University. Many thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much.
All
Good
right.
morning.
Indeed.
To our viewers.
So this budget, the theme for this year's budget reading was full monetization of Uganda's economy through agriculture, industrialization, expanding and broadening services, digital transformation and market access. Has this been reflected in the allocation, and how can it steer development for the country? Let me start with Bernard Cankara.
Well, thank you very much for having me once again. The budget has come as it is. This is way a little bit exorbitant budget. It's the first time that our budget has actually reached about 72 trillion.
Indeed.
It's a lot high level of increase when you look at the way we've been performing. So yes, there is a lot of optimism that this budget will, to a certain extent, will spur economic development and, of course, economic growth within the economy, especially when you look at the priority areas. Yeah. For example, His Excellency the President recently has been advancing for the standard gauge railway, which has been when you look at the major cost drivers of Uganda's economy is transport, and one of the things that really makes transacting businesses in Uganda is rather difficult is the cost of transportation. So when government come out clearly and say we are prioritizing railway transport, then there is a glimpse that perhaps this will spur economic development. However, to the extent whether Ugandans are able to fund the budget is the major question that comes before us. When you look at the budget, you realize that about 32 trillion dollars will be coming from domestic collections.
Indeed.
Do we have the capacity to raise that revenue? Historically, we have learned that our performance in terms of revenue collections or trying to meet up the revenue collection expectations has been limited. And so that raises question whether we can actually meet the expected target. But no doubt this budget is promising. We are seeing several efforts trying to streamline the budget. So I think it will spur economic development to a larger extent.
Oh, you talked about transportation and so forth, but then we are getting word that they did add 100 shillings on fuel tax, so it doesn't make it any better. So because the standard gauge railway is more of a futuristic project, but then so now and then you do have people using their cars and public transportation. It's going to boil down to the person using the taxi. At the end of the day, the common person, the 100 shillings.
That is where the tough questions are. Yeah, because when you increase fuel rates by 100 shillings, that means that there is going to be a direct increase in cost of production, for example. And that, like I said many times, either on the show or in other places where I've been speaking, it's not a way of increasing tax base. Yeah. My problem with Uganda Revenue Authority is that they have always focused on the low-hanging fruits. Yeah, they don't focus more on developing institutional systems that can broaden the tax base. They go for the low-hanging fruits because when you add 100 shillings on the on fuel, for example. That is almost a direct tax. You're
Indeed,
definitely sure that this money will come at the end of the day. Instead of focusing on how do we get the informal economy, the informal sector into the bracket of the tax base. And that cannot be done overnight. It requires a well-planned, structured systems put in place to be able to broaden the tax base. So it's a two-way. Like I said, my only problem is that the Uganda Revenue Authority have always focused on the low-hanging fruit instead of strategically thinking of how to broaden the tax base. And that is where the question is. Not so long ago I was on this show and I said it is uncalled for. There are other areas that government perhaps could have looked into so that to broaden the tax base. So,
well, I'm going to get to you
it's more
on
tough
that.
questions.
What are those other avenues through which government can mobilize resources without overly taxing our people? We shall get back to that. Let's also get to pick on Professor Sarah Ssali's brains on this issue. Well, we did talk about the budget focusing on agriculture, industrialization, expanding and broadening services, digital transformation and market access. Do you feel like all that was put into that budget and it was reflected, and how can it steer development from an educated perspective?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I think the budget was trying to be, the government is trying to be intentional through the budget to try and achieve those things. Yeah. For example, when you look, the taxation on things like pesticides went down, farm inputs really went down. It went down also for large-scale industrialization. There's some exemption for local investors who are going to use 70% of natural resources. So there's some intentionality in expanding investment in those sectors where the majority of our people live. And most of our people are in the informal sector, either as agriculturalists, and this is peasant agriculture, or in small-scale trade, these kinds of businesses which come up today and are gone tomorrow, are gone in a year's time. So there's an attempt to do something about it. Maybe the issue we should ask is, what is the aim of that intentionality? It seems to be that the aim of that intentionality is to widen the tax base and collect more. But sometimes you would wish, how I wish it was more about growth and it was more about the welfare of the people. Because if you got the growth, the welfare, the improving lifestyles of the people, it means even the tax base that you want to widen, the more people you want to bring into the formal sector, there should be returns, okay? Because as you can see, there's a lot of production in this country. That's how people survive. Yes. Otherwise people would be dropping dead due to starvation. But people are surviving. So how are they surviving? Because they are in the informal sector. Do they want to be in the informal sector, or are they being forced to be in the informal sector because of the costs and the risks of actually being formal? Because actually being formal, apart from attracting the taxman, indeed, people don't seem to see much more. So the intentionality in the budget about growing agro-industrialization, increasing trade, increasing many things is a good thing. And within that, of course, there's the whole aspect of growing jobs. And the budget has tried to speak to that. But I think there is need to ensure that the aim for us to do that is not simply to expand the tax base so as to foot our 75 trillion budget, but to say, how can Ugandans live better lives? Indeed. How can we give better services to the people? Without overly taxing. Without overly taxing. And by the way, in other countries they pay tax. Sometimes they even pay higher taxes than us. But they see the rewards of that taxation. Indeed. So the taxation is not simply to generate a big budget for the state to operate with all of us in it, but largely how can we tax more so that there are services, so that there are roads, so that there's free education, there's the NIH, National Health Service, NHS. So you have those kinds of things. So the intentionality is there, but the question is, how do we move to merely focusing on widening the tax base to focusing on improving services for the people?
Well, Bernard Cankara, you were telling me about the alternative sources of mobilizing funds, because many experts believe overly taxing Ugandans isn't a good model that can steer development. Yeah. So besides the taxes, where else can we get the money to fund the national activities?
Thank you once again. Just before I comment directly on that, I just want to add a few things. You see, taxation or paying tax is a responsibility of citizens. Yeah, and for any economy to grow, there is no way that government can survive on borrowing to grow. Yeah, and so it is the responsibility of us Ugandans to be able to fund government activities. However, the problem that our country we faced over time is the priority and the level of accountability within the government systems. And that is where Ugandans, usually when it comes to paying tax, they're a little bit, they develop cold feet. The perception and the commitment to pay tax has over time been reduced because of the behavior of government. And it is within the interest of government to check itself and behave properly as a body that we citizens of Uganda have entrusted to manage these taxes. So then, if government begins to become responsible, committed, and accountable to the revenues that we collect as citizens of this country, then we will see the perception of Ugandans towards tax improve. Even those that the professor is saying, that they fear to join the formal economy. Once the behavior of government is improved, then you'll see the perception of Ugandans change. Because Ugandans, by the way, if you move around the world, they love this country.
So they'd have no issue paying taxes, the issue is what the money is doing.
And they will not have a problem paying taxes, provided the behavior of government is checked and it's a little bit accountable. Now, how do we broaden the tax base of this country?
Yes.
You see, the reason why my fear is that we might not be able to raise the budget as it is, we may not be able to fund it as it is that there are areas that government can't look into. You are aware that this country runs a 10-year tax incentive holidays for attracting foreign direct investment in this country. And that has been going on for quite some time. And I can tell you that Uganda, we lose 2% of our GDP to tax incentive. So, in fact, a study which was done, I think, by a researcher at EPRC indicated that the cost-benefit analysis of our incentives have not transformed, has not replicated into the employment that we aspire. Into the tax revenue collection that we want, into the significant investment. So when you compare the cost-benefit analysis of the tax incentive versus the expectations of employment and all these other things, you don't see it. And annually we lose 2% of our GDP. And so the 10-year tax holiday that we think that we are attracting investors, it's not translating into the actual employment that we actually want. You see, the other
tax holiday would rather go to the local investors.
In other countries, my brother, is that they do progressive income tax. Yeah. So we can say, let's instead of paying 30% corporation tax, and if you're a new investor, okay, let's start with 12%. Let's start with 15%, depending on what the data shows us. Yeah. And then we progressively do that. But of course, there are other waivers that the investors can benefit. That is a way that we can then lessen or loosen the burden from other Ugandans. You might know that we are only 1 million Ugandans who actually actively pay tax.
Around 3 million.
Except now, when you add the 3 million, that includes the indirect taxes and all these other things, yes. But the actual income tax is about. So the truth is, there is need for a check for example, on corporation tax. And research has proven that. Many countries use it. It will not in any way make us a less attractive investment destination, but rather a committed and a responsible country that wants to grow by itself.
Indeed. All right. Any other models we could look at, alternative sources, except the tax holidays you talked about?
Build the systems. Build the systems that will incorporate the informal sector into the formal economy. And that cannot happen overnight. It requires significant investment in terms of popularizing and getting the information out there to the communities, and government being responsible. As it is, like I noted earlier, is that URA focuses on the low-hanging fruits.
Yes.
They don't want to invest in the system. Even when you go into the URA budget itself, and then you look at how much funds do they allocate for tax sensitization, getting the information to the local people. You've just seen recently with our people in the downtown Kampala.
And I did tell them when they were introducing EFRIS that people are going to start protesting if you do not go and carry out some kind of tax education.
And so when that came up, they started to put some money and start doing tax education. But that is rather late. Let's look at it in a strategic way. Put the money early enough, get the people sensitized, let people know that it is important to pay tax, and where and how they should be able to pay tax and what kind of tax, and let it be as fair and simple as possible.
Professor Ssali.
But the behavior of government
has to change. All right, people have to see the reflection of the taxes in developmental government projects, road infrastructure, health infrastructure, education, and so forth. Corruption has to be a thing of the past. Professor Ssali, we are seeing Kenyans actually planning to protest. They're looking at the second reading of the finance bill, and they're spending more than us, $31 billion on their budget. For us, we are spending $19.2 billion. So the Kenyans are more worried that this overtaxation is going to make life even worse. They're planning protests. In Uganda here, we are doing the same. But do you think there is another way we can look for money to fund the activities of this central government without necessarily focusing on taxing the local person? Because at some point, Ugandans are going to rise up and protest, like we saw during the EFRIS thing, but that was only the traders. We are looking at the national crisis where people come out and say we cannot live like this, where we are overly being taxed. From the educated perspective of Makerere University, what else should we be looking at in terms of taxation so that Ugandans get some breathing space?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I think we even need to put this whole thing in perspective. Because when we say we are 1 million taxpayers, who exactly is paying the tax? Those of us who are employed are paid from the consolidated fund. The consolidated fund gets money from the Chikubo men and the everything. So the Chikubo man pays tax, which pays my salary and I pay tax. So has more money been generated, or we are just moving that money around? I mean, you're also on a government payroll.
Indeed.
So
no, I am not.
You're not? Kyambogo University, sorry, I thought you were on a government payroll. So the whole issue is to look at this whole aspect of actually, is there more money? Or are we simply moving money between boxes, the same amounts in that? And largely it's because we are a service country. We don't have much in terms of industry. We don't have much in terms of investment. So you have to tax the few people in Chikubo, the few traders, and the few industrialists if they are not getting a tax holiday to pay me.
Romeo's payee.
Then I also pay tax on what has...
Pay as you earn.
So at the end of the day, I think it's the same amount of money circulating within the system. But I think one way we can go around this, I know overtaxation is a problem. For example, we pay VAT of 18%.
Indeed.
In countries like Nigeria, it's 6%. We have asked about this, and we have been informed by URA that because they're a bigger population. So if they are a bigger population all doing something, then 6%, because they are in more than 200 million. So 6% might bring what 18% may not bring out of our under 50 million population. So I think there's a danger in overtaxation, especially if you are taxing the same people.
Indeed.
Because as for us who are in the services industry, you're not necessarily generating wealth.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're simply being paid so as you pay.
Indeed.
But for the few who are actually generating wealth, the industrialists, the traders, and we keep taxing them, it's going to be very heavy on them in the long run. And that's why if you're interested in the statistics, I think EPRC is to do this, where people, the number of companies keep changing and going down.
Yeah.
So they increase but also go down, you have a problem. And that's why we should be interested in this whole aspect of informality. You know, the World Bank has done 2 studies. One is the long shadow of informality, challenges and policies. And this one was documenting how economies were going to recover after COVID in a context where economies are more informalized. And largely they were talking about Latin America. And another one was about informality, exit and exclusion. And how do people make decisions to exit or get, so when you look at it from URA, it's like people are doing tax avoidance, tax evasion. Yeah. But another way to see it is that the tax regime, the economic regime is actually excluding certain kinds of people.
Indeed.
That the moment they try to formalize and lift their head above the waters to enter, they are lumped with very high, they're slapped with very high taxation that they don't survive.
Indeed.
So within a year they are down. Within 5 years they are down. So we are going to be the same Ugandans.
So businesses are shutting down as a result of overtaxation.
Yes, and you see even the business are not the majority. The majority are the small and micro, who we should actually be incentivizing to join.
I like that.
And actually they would love to join. But if you're operating on 5 million capital and by registering your small thing you're going to get 10 million or 2 million taxation, you'll simply go under. So we need to find a way of graduating our people into the economy. And I know government has tried to do this with industrial parks, which are trying to create more jobs. So you're getting more people into paid employment. We are yet to see how much agro-industrialization would be there. Maybe if PDM and the NDP would have really focused on this thing other than just putting money in individual people's pockets, but actually put things in place for value addition so that people can produce more. Because in the villages, actually, people produce and it all goes to waste because of lack of preservation. But if they can produce more, then we shall have widened the tax base.
To create the industries for the local farmers.
Yes, and they don't have to be big industries. We have to learn from what other countries are doing. And then if we know, and to go back to what I said, if the people paying tax know that they're also going to get a service from that taxation, they will happily pay. But if you're going to pay tax and you're in Chikubu, but accessing your business is a challenge when it has rained, because KCCA has dug a pothole or it has done something and it's going to take forever to fill, or the containers have been stuck somewhere because of irregular taxation. So those leakages and those kinds of things make it difficult for the one who is supposed to pay tax to value and actually pay tax. At the end of the day, they will engage in actually lowering their tax obligation because the cost of transacting business is very high.
Indeed, I do understand what you mean by that, because when you look at people in the formal sector like Romeo Busiku, I do pay as you earn of at least 880,000 Uganda shillings. That 880,000 would be enough to handle most of my problems, but it's going to a payee. But then there's some gentleman in Chikubu who's actually making 10 million a day, but he's not paying pay as you earn at all. You understand? So people in the formal sector, we are being suffocated. So you are right when you say we need to widen the tax base to look for those individuals in the informal sector who are actually
who should be supported to come into the formal.
Who should be supported. So put more money in the hands of the people so that they could be able to pay taxes. You can expand more on that, Bernard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Putting more money in the hands of the people so that they could be able to pay taxes. Is that a good model? Can it work?
Yeah, of course. You see, the fundamental question is that are they able to translate that money into production? Because there's a study which we're doing at Kyambogo University, and we're trying to look at how Ugandans respond to money that is given to them, and one of the preliminary findings is guiding us towards a direction that Ugandans, once you give them money, their behavior changes a little bit, and so the question is, are they able to pick that money and transform it into a productive system, because you might be getting money into their hands, and they don't have the capacity to actually transform that capital into production. So it is okay. It is a good model. We've seen it work, but the ability of Ugandans to be able to transform that money into a production is because that's where the tax comes in from. As it is now, we are pouring money into the economy. For example, when you look at a good chunk of our budget is going into the Poverty Alleviation Initiative, the microfinance support centers, and all these other Myoga and all these other poverty eradication programs. But do people have the capacity to transform it into production? And are they aware that once they do that transformation, they're supposed to pay taxes? I think we have not yet reached there. Yeah, and we will put money there. I think it is important that money is being put, but again, the extent of training, the extent of capacity development must be enhanced, because then otherwise you're putting money and it's not being taken into production. And that is the risk. Yet you as government, you want, once you put money, you're investing in human capital, you want people to get out of poverty, but also at the end of the day, they go into a commercialized agriculture, like the President, His Excellency has always said, with the view that at some point you'll be able to pay taxes. But if you don't invest in their behavior and you don't invest in their training, then that money will not translate into production.
So PDM money minus the training and tooling of these farmers will go to waste if they are not given these skills.
If they don't have the skills. Research has shown that for the previous poverty elevation programs that we have invested over time, when you give them money, people actually marry 2 wives. Yeah. They go drinking and others leave home.
They increase the labor force for the farmers.
And they go into all tearing apart. The family gets disorganized because of the money and all that. And so it is one thing to put money into the economy. It is another thing to develop the capacity so that that fund can be translated into production. You've seen how Myoga has performed. They call it revolving fund, and I think my PhD study is focusing on that area. And you put money, and people take the money, and the behavior is completely different. And so government must really, as much as you put money, you must be cautious that you are able to make the people transform that resources into production. Otherwise, I can tell you without fear of contradiction, it's really money being wasted.
Indeed. Speaking of money being wasted, out of the 72 trillion shillings, 19 trillion is going to debt refinancing. That is how tough and bad the situation is. And of course, we've already hit the debt ceiling, 52%. Wow. And we are talking about 96 trillion Ghana shillings in debt. Can we sustain this? Can we sustain the trend of borrowing, Professor Ssali?
Well, thank you. I think it is also interesting that while for us we see this as a problem, the World Bank actually earlier this year said Uganda could borrow more. So I think for us we think it is high, but maybe the World Bank thinks differently. Probably it's to get us more into debt.
And to hold us hostage.
Yes, and hold us hostage. I think there is a problem. First of all, as many people have appreciated before us, many countries borrow. Okay, so debt is not just a problem that is peculiar to Uganda. Many countries, even the advanced countries, borrow for their development financing. And I think the only difference is most of those are borrowing from their local banks. Indeed. So the repayment rates are few. Like I think the most highly indebted country is Japan, but its repayment rate is around 3% because it's just using their own banks. Now for us, we borrow, and most of what we borrow is coming from external service providers. Indeed. So that, because they're in it for a business, so the interest rates are very high. But I think the issue is not to say we can't borrow, because at the end of the day, what are we borrowing the money for? We are borrowing the money for large-scale infrastructure projects. You want to do oil, the pipeline will need money. You want to do roads, that's going to require money. You're trying to industrialize, So we need to develop, and that money has to come from somewhere. Because if you don't go that way, you're going to keep people in chronic peasantry and in poverty. I think the only challenge is what are the returns of investment on the loans we borrow. I think that's where the discussion should be. Because if you had, like, I know this was in the press, and I hope the press was not misquoting, that there was some misappropriation or no, some reward system at the Uganda Investment Authority. And the interesting thing is it had come off a loan, a project loan. So the Minister of State for that bit, Honorable Anite, made sure that that issue was resolved. So, and this is just one entity. So if that is where the borrowing is going, then there is a problem. But if it goes for what it is intended to do, and there is value for money, and the projects are implemented in real time, in the long run, those projects will actually deliver returns. So the choice is not to develop. And if your choice is not to develop, okay, if your choice is to develop, the money has to come from somewhere. When you're running an economy which is around 87% peasantry, and even if you give them a myoga and you give them PDM cash, they're going to marry another wife and get drunk and be happy. And it's good to have Ugandans happy. But you see, that money has to come from somewhere, so we have to borrow. But the issue is, can we monitor, can we evaluate and ensure that the borrowing goes to where it was? And in the future, when these things pay off, then maybe we shall reduce our borrowing because we shall have more Ugandans.
But that is understandable. We need to borrow, but if we put that money to right use, then no problem there. But then the rate at which we are borrowing, it is so high, the rate at which we are borrowing. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we're talking about 50 trillion, 60 trillion. By 2023, it was 86. We are talking about 96. Next year, we shall be around 100 something. So the rate, are you worried by the rate at which we are borrowing?
Yeah. The rate is worrying, and maybe other than production and infrastructure development, we also need to check our rate of expenditure. And that's where we talk about issues of around efficiency and effectiveness. Do we need such a budget, or do we need to exercise prudence somewhere?
Indeed.
So we may need to look at what are some of the prudent solutions. Maybe we don't need many people having many cars in a very long motorcade. Maybe we need to reduce on that.
Reduce on expenditures.
Yes,
that's
so
a good one.
Maybe reduce on luxuries. And I remember when this government had come to power, the budget used to show what the priorities are, what the luxuries were, and the luxuries attracted more taxation. The basics did not attract much taxation. So we need to go back to that definition of what is priority, and then how do we hold everyone accountable to that? Because if a Chikubo man is bleeding his tax or her tax, and a Chikubo woman bleeding her tax, and then she or he sees lavish expenditure, that brings ill feeling. But if we are in it all together, and we are all tightening our belts together, then people will understand that the borrowing is worth it.
Amazing.
So cut expenditure, but also increase production.
Thank you, Professor Sarah Ssali. Bernard Cankara, kindly let us in on some of the modalities that we could employ as a country to do away with this borrowing. Do we really need to borrow at this speed?
Two things.
Your 2 cents.
There is no economy that has taxed itself to prosperity, and there is no economy that has borrowed itself to prosperity.
Thank you.
Sure.
So it is a two-way. Yes.
Ssali seems to disagree, but go ahead. But I like this.
So either way, it is both ends are really snapshots. Yeah, but a growing economy like, or a small economy like Uganda, you cannot entirely rely on taxing. Otherwise, that is the cry and the perceptions that you hear around. Yeah, you'll end up overtaxing the citizens, and so government has to go and borrow. Yeah, and borrowing, by the way, let's like Professor noted, it's not in any way bad. Yeah, but the priority investment. This country borrows even to pay salaries. Okay, the cost of our public service is way high. Like Professor noted earlier, cut down the really wasteful budgeting areas, yeah, that are really making us waste money and resources, cut them down. But the cost of public service is a major one we can all run to, and the behavior of public servants, it's one that we can run to. Yeah, there was, I think, recently I had the permanent secretary to Ministry of Health, I think, who said that we are not going to have workshops in the hotels. All workshops should go within the government premises. Yeah, and those are innovative or intentional decisions that the permanent secretaries can make in order to cut down the budget within their small ministries. Otherwise, government, the rate at which we are borrowing, in 2021, I wrote a paper on titled "Development of No Development." In that paper, we did cite that the debt ceiling is way too high, and government spent most of its money, almost our revenue, almost, I think, if I can recall, about 90% of our annual collections goes into debt service.
Indeed.
Yeah. And there is no way you can prosper or gain a high level of prosperity or development with such kind of behavior.
Indeed, I hear you. That is Bernard Cankara, researcher, public policy and governance expert at Kyambogo University. We also did have Professor Ssali. I would also like to hear more about how oil is going to be a game changer after we talk to Ivan Walinyoro, because I do know oil will give us some hope. We shall make some money and we can independently be able to, service our own budget as a country. So I would like to hear those pointers. Let's finish our conversation here with Professor Ssali and Bernard Cankara. We were talking about the overtaxation of Ugandans and where we can get reprieve in that regard. They were telling me that, yes, there's another venture in oil that we could use to ward off the pressure that we are seeing on taxes being mobilized locally and the pressure being put on individuals and families and traders and so forth. Oil, is it a curse or a blessing? Let's discuss that in the dying minutes of Morning at 10 TV. Bernard Cankara, we are talking about 32 trillion shillings coming from your pocket and mine in the near future when we start, exploring our own oil, drilling it. You understand?
Yeah.
Do you have some kind of a positive message that maybe we shall be able to fund our own budget?
I think Ugandans' expectations should be measured. Really.
The 6 million barrels.
Yeah.
They are not cause for celebration.
Indeed, oil production is good and it is exciting. When you just hear it from outside, you think it is very exciting. But to understand it much better, you need to go and look at how has other countries that have had oil behaved and how are they performing. Yeah. And there are many, not just Nigeria. Yeah. But then you realize that if the revenue or the proceeds that come from oil production is not targeted, intentional investment, we will not be able to achieve much. And I think government, it is in the interest of government to avoid hyping the oil production. Oil is good, but when you overhype it, perhaps you will end up reducing perception of Ugandans and commitment on paying taxes. Perhaps they will start thinking and dreaming that will relieve the tax obligation.
At least by half.
From citizens.
At least by 50%.
And that is the risk. And that is the risk. Because when you overhype oil production and you think that you're going to get all this lump revenue that is coming from oil, and that revenue is not put into targeted investment, then the burden will come back to citizens. And if you have overhyped and citizens' perceptions towards tax obligation has reduced, then, and yet your oil production, remember we have about 6.5 million euros unless we identify other
barrels,
6.5 million barrels. Unless we identify other oil fields, that will also come to an end.
We've identified some in northern Uganda.
And if you have destroyed the perceptions of Ugandans on paying tax, then how will the country proceed from there? And so, yes, I am optimistic that this oil will support government in terms of the targeted investment, which will really sustain and support economic growth and economic development in this country for quite some time. But let's not hype it that much.
Indeed. Let me hear from Professor Ssali. What do you make of this? Are you overly optimistic that now that we are going to start drilling our own oil, Yes, we'll be able to reduce pressure on the budget. Remember, we are ring-fencing Uganda National Oil Company, UNOC. Most of the oil marketing companies in Uganda are going to be buying from UNOC directly. Shell, Total, Starbucks, and all these other, petrol stations are going to be buying directly from UNOC. So, do you envisage a situation where that kind of modus operandi reduces pressure on our budget?
Yeah, thank you very much. But I think there are two different things.
Go ahead.
I think the purpose of UNOC was to cut out the middleman.
Indeed.
Because we were buying from the middlemen instead of buying direct. And some middlemen had even come as far as coming internally and becoming retailers.
Indeed.
So I think UNOC has a role to play, and every country has to control certain sectors that are essential. I don't believe in full economic liberalization.
Indeed.
And controlling the oil sector in form of UNOC, I think, is not a bad way to go. So that is one thing. And I think what it means with UNOC is we are going to get more value for our investment, for the amount of money we purchase the oil from. Then you have the production. The production is a long-term investment. I'm scared when we say 6.5 million euros, because in some countries they
6.5
million barrels, because 6.5 million barrels, there are some countries that produce 1 million barrels per day. Some here wondering whether shall produce in 6 days. But what we need to remember is that this is a long-term investment. It's advantageous in that we shall develop so many lines from here, the kerosene, wax, lubricants, all these things which you lose when you export crude fully. So that is an advantage. But, and of course, the other thing, it's a low-hanging fruit that's going to create jobs. But what we shouldn't forget is that there's investment that has been put in it. And this investment, some is domestic, some investment is international, and we have to manage our expectations so that we give the investment the right time from which to reap from it. Otherwise, we shall just end up being disgruntled.
Indeed. Well, time is first spent. The topic is so salacious, and there are so many details pertaining